Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. On this episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined by Jackson Gardner, who is currently a medical student at Einstein Medical College, and who is the translator and annotator of the Ibn Ezra's Hakdama to his Pirushat Torah, which is published as Understanding Pshat, Ibn Ezra's Introduction to his Torah Commentary, and it was published by Dot Press. And so, thank you, Jackson, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let's tell the listeners about this book.
Yeah. So it's called Understanding Pshat. It's primarily a translation annotation of Ibn Ezra's first Hakdama to his first shorter commentary on Torah, the more famous one people know. So in it, he expands upon various paths to how people have commented on Torah in the past. And he tries to critique them and provides his own path. And in doing so, he essentially elaborates what Peshat really means. So the translation annotation really aims to flesh out what Peshat is, what his commentary is trying to accomplish in that realm. And it has a number of different essays and supplementary material on the back to further help the reader in that goal.
Okay, so let's dive right in, right there. There's been a bunch of podcasts in Ibn Ezra, one on his Chumash commentary with the author of Das Ezra. It was a number of years ago, but we're focusing on the introduction. So he has kind of four paths, right, that he talks about, and he outlines, and he says what's wrong with them. So if you want to just outline in brief, we're not going to go through all of them. And yours is an English translation of the whole thing, and then it's got this very nice annotation, a lot of footnotes. So let's start off just in brief for the listeners, for those that are familiar or those that aren't familiar with Ibn Ezra, like what are his four paths? And, he goes through discrediting each one.
Right. So he brings four paths that prior commentators have tread on, and then he brings what he finds to be the correct fifth path. So just in brief, the first path is that the Geonim used primarily, which was a lot of philosophical treatises and using the Torah more as a sort of springboard for large philosophical essays on a variety of topics. And he's not such a fan of using a commentary to talk about that much additional content. That should just be a separate book. The second path is that used primarily by the Karaites. So it essentially eliminates the Torah Sheba'al Peh from the conversation and says we are going to interpret the written text and all halachic matters purely based on the literal written language. And so Ibn Ezra, as a rabbinic champion, says that this is, again, very incorrect and in this case, damaging to the reader. The third path is primarily, he believes, used by Christians. And it essentially turns the Torah completely into allegory. So especially in halachic matters that now for Christianity, it's no longer of legal relevance. And so it has to have a secret metaphorical message. So Ibn Ezra feels that metaphor is important and it can be used. But to turn all of Torah into a bunch of esoteric mysteries is not so productive. The fourth and final path he critiques is that of Rashi and some of his followers in Europe who love to bring midrashim. Ibn Ezra loves midrashim, and he talks about various derashot, but he finds that it's not appropriate to simply cite those and confuse the reader. It should be kept separate from the peshat of the text. And so then in the fifth and final path, he explains his view, which is really about the core peshat based on the grammar, the context of the pesukim, the Torah Sheba'al Peh halachic framework, and kind of putting all those pieces together.
Yeah, and, it's interesting because all the different types, really, of paths that Ibn Ezra says, he kind of quotes throughout his commentary. Those that learn Ibn Ezra, you'll find him quoting Karaites. He obviously quotes Midrashim. He does do all these things. Even, perhaps Christians at times, he definitely does, do these things. The Gainim, as you talk about, Sajid and others, he definitely does quote from all those that he says, oh, no, but that's not their way. I guess, do you find him to be saying that that's just not the way that one should approach a commentary overall? Obviously, you can take bits and pieces from each one.
Absolutely. Yeah. And part of what I tried to show, I think, in the appendices material in the back is that Ibn Ezra absolutely spends time, especially in his longer commentary that we have on Shemot and Bereshit. He does write at length on philosophical things. He does talk about science. He does at times, he usually will mention Midrashim in the sense of this is a good Midrash. He won't cite it. He'll just point out that it's nice. And he himself will go into metaphor and mysteries. And while he disagrees with Karaites, he cites, for example, Yefet ben Ali about 100 times from what I saw in grammatical manner. So for sure, Ibn Ezra very much uses all of these tools, but he mostly critiques the person who makes that the focus of their commentary. He prefers to keep the focus mostly on the Peshat to really aid the reader in the core objective.
Let's talk a little bit more about Ibn Ezra's commentary. So first of all, for those interested, you mentioned Ibn Ezra's long commentary. Most of Ibn Ezra that we have is the short one, and there's the long one.
Right.
So now it's published, most you can find it, but we really have mostly the short commentary. It's quite different from his. And Ibn Ezra is known to be very terse. So for those reading that, some of the hard part of reading Ibn Ezra, you need some sort of commentary that opens it up.
Right.
Ibn Ezra Yehuda or Das Ezra or something that assists you in that. Okay, so let's talk about Ibn Ezra's own path, and you do show this in the appendices. Ibn Ezra himself has like short examples in each path, like to illustrate what's right or wrong. But just the fifth path, Ibn Ezra's path itself, just to clarify a little bit more. What is his path? And you do have appendices, and you can mention them here already, where you take the other Mefarshim, and you'll show, okay, this is a Pasuk, this is a Pshat of Rab Sadia, of this one, that one, the other one, and here comes Ibn Ezra with his Pshat. But if you want to just give one or two examples to show Ibn Ezra's, his own path, his fifth path, so to speak.
Right. Right. So for Ibn Ezra, right, he's very Peshat focused. So for example, I show that, Ramban at the start of Bereshit, he has a whole very Kabbalistic, mystical approach to a lot of the mysteries that we're, talking about in terms of Bereshit. Ibn Ezra also has a sod on the idea of Bereshit bara Elokim, but he breaks it down in a very structured grammatical sense, in that he explains what bara is based on. He talks about the roots, he talks about the constructs, very much in the Peshat, and only at that point does he hint, and if you've understood what I've talked about in this case, and you've also, studied the deeper wisdoms, then you will be able to kind of see my point, right? He really builds on it. Or, elsewhere, Rashbam is famous for, despite not being a Karaite, sometimes interpreting the halachic pesukim literally. So, for example, Totafot, which refers to tefillin, traditionally he says it could just be a metaphor. And for Ibn Ezra, he says no, the Torah she'ba'al peh has to be in the Peshat itself. And so Totafot does have to mean a literal tefillin mitzvah. So those, I point those out, right, as examples where he is kind of using those other tools, but building them from his Peshat.
Okay, so let's talk about the translation, because this is an English translation. So for those interested in reading in English, and the annotation as well. So there's more than just reading it in English. First of all, there are others English translations of this Akdama. So how does yours differ? What's new to your translation? And just, I guess that goes hand in hand with, did you stick to Ibn Ezra's rhyming, kind of his interesting prose? How did you deal with that when translating this work?
Right. That's a great question. So I looked at the prior translations for sure. I think that it's always good to see kind of the paths that have already been trodden and get good inspiration, let's call it. And I think that for my translation, what I really tried to aim for is, I'm a big, literalist. I really want to be as precise as possible with the Hebrew that he uses, which is often, as you mentioned already, very terse, very cryptic. So it often requires a lot of supplementation. And I found that one difference, I think, between my edition and prior's is that I have perhaps inserted more English words in brackets to try and make it as readable as possible, which I think prior editions sometimes struggled with a bit. And I also think prior editions were a bit more academic in their audience. And so the English can, at times, I find, be very highbrow and very lofty, which is beautiful. But I wanted something which was perhaps a bit more modern and a bit more readable, while still trying to honor a writer who very much uses very lofty poetic language. And as for the rhyming, question, I think I hopefully did a good job, or an okay job, in his introductory poem, which is a very beautiful rhyming scheme. He uses the word Ezra, both for his own name and also for the idea of helping, for God to help him in his commentary. And he uses other words similarly, like his father, Me'ir, and using that to give light to his commentary. So I tried when I could to rhyme those things. And when it didn't work, I tried to indicate in the footnotes, at least to the reader, to say, if you look in the Hebrew, you'll see this beautiful wordplay, especially when he critiques those he doesn't like. He can be very sharp and very witty with using their names against them.
To give the example to the listener for what you mean when you said doing certain brackets, it says, the fifth path is the one upon which I, brackets, Ibn Ezra, will base my commentary. It appears to me to be correct, proven, brackets, in the presence of, end bracket, God, whom alone I fear. I will not show favoritism, brackets, to anyone when it comes to interpreting, end bracket, the Torah. So there's more here, but just to show you how you really add on to kind of flesh it out, but you did put in brackets, show Ibn Ezra, it's not his actual words.
Right.
So it's in brackets that's your addition. Okay, the book also contains, you wrote an introduction to the work as well, going over it, and also Sina Ken, who's been on the podcast before, Sina wrote The World's Real Life of Rabbeinu Avram Ibn Ezra, a short little like bio, if you will. And then in the back, you did include the Hebrew text, which is nice. So for those interested, you can actually read the Hebrew text, and there's a bunch of appendices in a short book, about 100 pages. So why did you decide to translate this Ibn Ezra, this book, this Hakdama of Ibn Ezra, if you will?
Right. That's a great question. So Sina actually approached me and initially asked me if I could oversee such a project for the Hakdama itself. And at the time, I, thought it would just be looking over the translation, making sure it was readable. But really, as I, was working on it and as I was looking for footnote opportunities, I realized that so much comes up in terms of what is Peshat, what is textual interpretation, what is the role of Dirashot, how did Ibn Ezra view Sod and esotericism, how does he view science, how does he view the role of Halakha and the Be'al Peh with the Bichtav together. And so it kind of grew and expanded. And, through conversations with Sina and a wonderful collaboration, we spoke about, this could be a great sort of cornerstone in which to build a slightly larger work, which could really educate the reader on all of these Peshat related topics in one.
Who would you say this book is meant for?
So I think this book is probably meant for two different people. I think one is the person who is interested in deepening their Tanakh study and would like to understand what Peshat commentary is. I think today a lot of people are under the impression that Peshat just means being able to read the words perhaps and translate them literally. But even for Ibn Ezra with the Torah Shebe'al Peh and certain other nuances, it's much deeper than that. And so to give the reader a bit of a toolbox for how to approach the Tanakh in general as they study it. And I think the second intention is for those who are interested in sort of a classical Geonic Sfaradi education, which is not as popular today. It's not as widespread, but which Ibn Ezra, Yehuda Levi, Harambam, the Geonim came from, and really seeing how they approached education, how they approached the importance of textual understanding, and expanding, I think, an arena of Jewish history, which is perhaps less talked about at times and less accessible to the especially English-speaking community.
Okay. So I will link in the show notes to the book. It's available on Dot Press now as a website. You can purchase it there. I think it's free shipping everywhere, and then also available via Amazon. So thank you, Jackson, for joining me to discuss Understanding Peshat.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.